Welcome to the Latin American Perspectives podcast. My name is Alexander Scott, Outreach Coordinator at Latin American Perspectives. Today we will be discussing the main theme of the September LAP issue, Open Veins Revisited, Charting the Social, Economic, and Political Contours of the New Extractivism in Latin America, with editors Linda Farthing and Nicole Fabricant. Linda Farthing is a writer, researcher, and educator who has written 3 books on Bolivia. She writes for The Guardian, The Nation, Al Jazeera, and Indian Country Today, and is a contributing editor for the North American Congress on Latin America. Her latest policy report is The Left in Power, Perspectives on Effective Progressive Governance, The Case of Bolivia. Nicole Fabricant is an associate professor of anthropology at Towson University in Baltimore. She has published several books and articles on resource extraction and landless politics in contemporary Bolivia, and has been working on a long-term participatory action project in South Baltimore on environmental injustice. Good morning, Linda and Nicole. It's a pleasure to have you both here with me today.
Good morning, Alex.
Good morning, Alex. Thanks.
Just to start, I was wondering if you could briefly summarize for our listeners the theme of the September issue.
Okay, well, the issue looks at the social, political, and economic interconnections of how resource-based economies interact with the world economy. And some of the questions that we look at, or that the issue looks at, are around foreign direct investment and what kind of impact that has on developed policy in Latin American countries, and how the latest boom in resource commodities throughout Latin America has changed the relationship between commodities and these processes and state. It also has a lot of focus on how particular resources and particular extractivist projects impact on territorial control and state displacement and the natural and environmental they do. So we ask questions such as how does expanding extractivism affect the way that nature is constructed and good, and how is resistance processed? We look fairly closely at some of the contradictions in the things by governments in Latin America, both the last several years and the ones that remain in power, and look at how has developed and what it. Finally, we start to raise questions about how we think about alternatives in Latin America to the extractive model.
Nicole, can you talk more about how this issue came about and provide some background information on the previous scholarship on extractivism in Latin America that your issue builds upon?
Sure. So I guess it was about 8 or 9 years ago, it was a long time ago, that Rosalind and I spoke at ELASA. She had thought about possibly putting out an issue on extractivism and post-extractivism in Latin America. There were a series of panels at ELASA, and she really wanted to think about sort of new actors like China, sort of European interests in Latin America. At the time, she was particularly interested in Bolivia, and the conversations were very preliminary, I think, at that stage. She had worked on the 2-part series with Linda's late husband, Ben Cole, on Bolivia, and she just had this incredible sort of experience with him editing on the Bolivia issue, and kind of wanted to come back to some of those Andean nation states and think about the effects of extractivism, but also new international and transnational actors. So early on, we brought folks like Gabriela Valdivia, who's a professor of geography at UNC, into the project. She wrote for this issue on wind, and we'll talk a little bit more about that really interesting article on the multiple layers of violence tied to alternative forms of energy. And we brought folks like Teresa Velázquez, who was looking at conflicts over water and mining in Ecuador, into the project. And then, slowly, I think there was a call for papers, and there was just a ton of interest that it became a 2-part issue because of the numbers of people across Latin America really working on interesting topics tied to to resource extractivism. So I think the initial idea, although it's evolved over these years because it has been this very long period of submission and revision, the initial idea was to revisit some of the early political economic work kind of in anthropology, Sid Mintz's work on sugar, Eric Wolf, Europe and the People Without Histories, and thinking about that era of radical anthropology and social sciences or social scientists, thinking about commodities and export-oriented economies. And so early on, I think we had envisioned, what has changed since that period. Obviously, there's a lot, and Linda's going to speak more directly to this, but about the research in Latin America today and the very vibrant debate on the left, because there's no uniform position, on extractivism. It's very complicated, and many different actors take differing positions on how economies basically are running today off of these forms of extractivism. So maybe Linda wants to chime in a little bit about some of the Gudiñas and the Svampas and some of the folks that Manuel de la Fuentes, that we cite are part of this debate in Latin America about extractivism and post-extractivism.
Yeah, I think that what is happening is that social scientists in Latin America are attempting to make sense of the impact of this latest commodity movement, what many people call the new colonization of Latin America, because has been such a dramatic refocusing and reprimatizing. It has proven to be such a dramatic focusing of these economies back to what they were originally, which were highly extractivist. Now, in some cases of some countries like Bolivia or Venezuela, that's not to say that they stopped being extractivist, but other Colombia or Argentina or Mexico had managed to diversify their economy, and this boom in extractivism has really backed a more model. And there's a lot of debate, particularly Eduardo Gudinas, who has written about neo-extractivism and making the argument that the unified governments have reinforced the extractivism that already existed in their societies and managed to negotiate a bigger share of the barrel, as it were, with multinational corporations, and use this money in ways that previous countries ought to fund a higher level of social services, which in turn has made a major contribution to reducing poverty levels throughout Latin America. However, there is a lot of criticism of the model, of this neo-extractivist model, that refers to a lot of Maristela Samba, and we were also informed by the editing of a book called Lógicas de Desarrollo Extractivismo y Cambio Climático that was edited by Manuel de la Fuente, Tania Ricalde, and Ángel Salvador. So there's a lot of work going on in Latin.
So going off of that idea of the commodities boom and the neo-extractivist model, in the introduction you note that this has driven resistance and organizing movements, but the outcomes have been uneven, and that organizing has not always emerged where we would expect it to. Can you discuss this a little further?
Yeah, I think that some of the cases that we show represent or demonstrate the ways in which resistance to extractivism can be expressed in cultural forms as opposed to direct political resistance. And I think the case that's discussed of the water rituals in northern Chile is a case in point of that experience. And that's not to say that historically people have not resisted imperialism and extractivism in their countries through cultural forms, but those cultural forms are continuing and certainly interacting with the more dominant political.
Right, and I think that's a really important point that Linda mentions, because we could think about potentially Bolivia as a space where those cultural frameworks were, during particularly the neoliberal era, shaped and framed in such a way that it became a very political resistance to a model that was essentially not just extracting resources like gas, but exporting them to other countries. So there was a very direct anti-imperialist agenda that perhaps we're not seeing the same form of resistance today. And so I think when we were at least having conversations, Linda and I, about this, the direct political resistance is much more perhaps shaped in a cultural framework. I mean, I'm thinking about also parallel contexts in parts of the United States, where in Appalachia or even in New Orleans or NoDAPL, folks are directly resisting pipelines, right? There's ways in which they're using their bodies. In Appalachia, folks are hanging from drag lines and trying to stop the means of production. They are halting the pipelines through a very embodied kind of protest. And not to say that places in Latin America, we haven't experienced that or seen it, but certainly I think some of the articles speak much more to the cultural frames of resistance.
You conclude in the introduction by discussing how the model of endless extraction is entirely unsustainable, arguing that a transition away from extractivism must involve rethinking the relationship between human beings and nature. Could you describe for our listeners how some governments in Latin America have taken action to implement and codify policies protecting the rights of nature?
Well, in both Bolivia and Ecuador, there have been laws that defend the rights of Mother Nature that have been adopted. However, in neither case has there been any clarification about what that might mean in practice and or any signs that these laws will be applied in any way.
Right. So I think that our back and forth has often been about sort of symbolic forms of constitutional reform versus actually seeing sort of structural shifts. And this is a very tough question. I would say that this is perhaps the question today across Latin America because there have been improvements, as Linda mentioned, in terms of the rights of Mother Nature, protection of critical resources in Ecuador and Bolivia, but it's one thing to put it in a constitution and another to actually see structural shifts on the ground. So what would that mean? Supporting agroecology, supporting projects of small-scale farmers that are experimenting with non-pesticide, toxic forms of agriculture. It would mean actually investing in small-scale agriculture in terms of, extractivism beginning to think beyond just a one-dimensional extractivist model to diversifying economies, to looking at other forms, perhaps experimenting with alternative and renewable. But this is complicated too, because I think Gabriela Valdivia's piece really points to the fact that renewables is not solely the answer in Latin America. And I think we see that across the context of the United States as well. People are calling for community-controlled, community-owned forms of solar or wind, not controlled by large transnational corporations, because if these corporations continue to control renewables, then we will see the same kinds of violence occurring in terms of violence against nature, violence against Native peoples, and community rights. And so their article, Valdivia and Selwoods, really discusses that co-optation of renewable energy and the effects that it has on indigenous land. So, this is not a simple answer. Linda and I have been playing around with Fitz's work and thinking about the ways in which he talks about slowing extraction and particularly trying to use that as a model to think about Latin America. But certainly there are creative experiments and movements like Landless Peasant Movement in Brazil, where they are experimenting with their own community-controlled forms of energy. And part of this is a model that they're trying to spread across places like Brazil and other countries in Latin America, where folks would have total control over their own production of energy.
Well, unfortunately, we're going to have to leave it there. But Linda and Nicole, thank you so much for providing us with this insight into the dynamic landscape in Latin America.
Thank you. Thanks for
Thank
covering.
you, Alex.
So that is all the time we have for today, but thank you for listening in. Please don't forget to add us on Facebook, Twitter, Pinterest, YouTube, and all of our other wonderful social media sites. Please join us again in November for our next podcast. Hasta luego.